Greetings, comrades! This year is coming to an end, which means it's time for the holidays. For most of my viewers, probably the most important holidays of the year: Catholic Christmas and New Year's Eve. As you may have guessed, we don't celebrate Catholic Christmas in Russia. Almost. The country's main holiday since the Great October Revolution has been the New Year. Today we are going to talk about the history of this holiday, how and since when it was celebrated in the Russian Empire, how the Soviet government made it the main day of the year, and what New Year traditions have survived in Russia to this day.
С Новым годом, дорогие друзья! С новым 2000!
The onset of the New Year has been an important day in Russia since ancient times. Up to 1492, the New Year began on March 1st, from 1492 to 1699 on September 1st. In Slavic pagan tradition, the beginning of a new year in March was logical. Nature awakens, a new agricultural cycle begins, and thus life takes a new turn. But Christianity came to Russia in 988, and Christians counted the new year from January 1st, as Julius Caesar bequeathed, or from September 1st, as was customary in Byzantium. Why has Russia used March 1st for more than 500 years after that? Besides, in all other aspects, Russia adopted the Byzantine chronology from the creation of the world. And so it went. For 6 months, the year coincided with Constantinople, and for the other 6, did not. But nobody paid much attention to it. The New Year was not really celebrated as a holiday. For the urban population, the meaning of the agricultural cycle was irrelevant, and in the villages the spring holiday gradually merged into a bizarre tangle with the pagan Maslenitsa and Christian Easter. In addition, the peasants were not taught to read and did not keep calendars. Therefore, this date was important only to the Tsar, the boyars and the clergy, who kept the chronicles. In the middle of the 15th century, Orthodox Constantinople fell, and thus the whole Orthodox world was left without a unifying center. Moscow decided to take this crown, along with the title of Third Rome. In many respects, it was for this very purpose that Russia switched to celebrating the New Year according to the Byzantine canon on September 1st. And since the mid-16th century, it was a feast day with its own ceremonies and rituals, and not just a flip of the calendar. On the cathedral square of the Moscow Kremlin, in front of the northern doors of the Cathedral of the Archangel, a large platform covered with Persian and Turkish carpets was set up. From opposite sides of the square, the two main leaders of the state, the Patriarch and the Tsar, came out to meet each other. Then the Tsar would lay his hands on the icons, the Patriarch would bless him and ask him about his health, and common people on the square would bow their heads and greet them both. What a fun way to celebrate! Everything was changed, as always, by Peter the Great. In 1697, while traveling through Europe with his grand embassy, the Tsar was surprised to learn that the Julian calendar had not been used there for more than 100 years, and that now the counting was done from the nativity of Christ. Peter wanted to make Russia as European as possible, so naturally this shortcoming had to be eliminated. After his return, Peter issued a decree according to which the year 7208 from the creation of the world became 1700, which Russia met on the familiar for modern man day, January 1st. In addition, the decree clearly prescribed to celebrate this day in the image and likeness of the European nations that had impressed the Tsar so much during his trip. It was then that the tradition of decorating houses and yards with spruce and pine branches, which still lives today, appeared in Russia. Some people met the innovation with bafflement. While for Europeans a spruce was a symbol of eternal life, the Slavs had associated conifer branches with funeral rituals for centuries, and it felt strange to greet the new year and immediately bury it. But gradually people got used to it. Also, as a sign of merriment, the townspeople were to wish each other a happy new year, and from January 1st to 7th at night they were to light fires with wood, or brushwood, or straw, or tar barrels filled with them. The main action was to be carried out on Red Square, lighting fiery funs, firing tries with muskets, and finally letting off some rockets. That is, they launched fireworks and exploded firecrackers. Just like today. In addition, Peter, like some of his predecessors, sought to separate the state from the church, so no more religious rituals on New Year's Day. But people still perceived the New Year as a semi-church holiday. Because of the secular and church calendars shift in relation to each other, the New Year Day had conveniently positioned itself right between Christmas and the day of the baptism of Jesus, which meant it was possible to celebrate for 2 whole weeks. Under Elizabeth I, who loved luxury, there emerged a tradition of New Year's balls masquerades. Up to 15,000 courtiers gathered every year on December 31st in the palace and danced until 7 am. Ordinary people entertained themselves by sleigh rides and ice slides. In large cities there were fairs with circuses, and on the Sparrow Hills, where the famous building of the Moscow State University is located now, there were fireworks. In the days of Catherine II, the New Year tradition began to include an exchange of gifts and a special holiday table. In the 19th century, there came other attributes of the holiday: champagne, Christmas decorations, postcards. The first public Christmas tree in the Russian Empire was put in 1852, in the building of St. Petersburg Yekaterinhof station. Just like in Europe in the second half of the 19th century, the myth of a singular gift giver began to take shape in Russia, a mysterious old man who brings gifts and puts them under the Christmas tree. But the name Santa Claus or Saint Nicholas did not become popular in Russia. In the early 1860s, the mysterious giver briefly bore the name of Old Knecht Ruprecht. In the 1870s, Ruprecht became Grandfather Nicholas. A decade later, he became known as the kind Morozko or simply Moroz, Frost. Then suddenly there was a variant of the old man Yolkich, the spirit of the old Yolka, which means spruce. And only at the beginning of the 20th century did the old man finally got the name Ded Moroz, Grandfather Frost. His granddaughter Snegurochka, the Snow Maiden, owes her birth to Russian literature. In the folk tales collected by Alexander Afanasyev, Snegurochka or Snegurushka was the name of a girl molded from the snow by a childless old couple. In 1973, Alexander Ostrovsky wrote a play called The Snow Maiden, in which the snowy girl became the daughter of frost and spring. And it would seem everything would have stayed the same to this day. But the Bolsheviks came to power. After the revolution in 1918, the Bolsheviks switched to the Western Gregorian calendar. There was a difference of 13 days between the old and new calendar styles, and so the unofficial holiday of the old New Year appeared. They also abolished the New Year's celebration, considering it a counter-revolutionary holiday imbued with the idea of bourgeois decadence and clerical obscurantism. They called it a religious nonsense and a stupid thing, a savage and priestly custom. Instead of the New Year, they introduced the holiday Red Blizzard, celebrating the day of the beginning of the World Revolution. Only it did not take root. People still clandestinely put up Christmas trees and gave presents to children. There is, however, another version, that in the first years the Bolsheviks did celebrate the New Year, and even Grandpa Lenin and his wife Krupskaya spent the first Soviet New Year in the company of workers of the Vyborg side, drinking carrot tea, eating croutons, and listening to the Internationale. And the persecution of the New Year began later, along with increased pressure on the church in the late 20s. In any case, for at least 10 years, the celebration of New Year's Eve in the USSR was explicitly forbidden. Still, there was little entertainment in the country in those years, and the Soviets quickly softened. On December 28, 1935, one of the leaders of Soviet Ukraine, Pavel Postashev, appealed from the pages of Pravda newspaper to organize a New Year's party for children. This article is considered the beginning of the campaign to rehabilitate the New Year. From 1936, the creation of new, already purely Soviet attributes of New Year celebrations began. The production of New Year toys and decorations was opened. Some pre-revolutionary traditions were borrowed, but all the religious components of the holiday were excluded for good. On the Soviet Christmas tree, or well, New Year tree, there were traditional Christmas balls, snowflakes and cotton bears, snow maidens, fruits and ruby stars, dirigibles, flags with pictures of pioneers and little Octobrists. By the way, there is even a version that the color of Grandfather Frost's coat in the USSR was changed from blue to red, specifically to link his image with the party. Already in January 1937, the renewed Ded Moroz and Snegurochka welcomed guests to a lavish celebration at the Moscow House of Unions. The New Year was now celebrated widely and pompously. The biggest New Year trees were set up in Gorky Park and Manege Square. The emphasis was placed on the collective component of the holiday. Children came to the large-scale New Year's performances organized by the state in the cities, called Novogodnye Yolki, literally New Year's spruces. After the performance, each child was given a special New Year's candy set. One could not simply go and buy a ticket to any of them. Schools and kindergartens were allocated a certain quota for celebrations of a higher level through departments of public education, through trade unions, held in Moscow at the House of Unions or in the Kremlin itself. These tickets were given to the best of the best. It was every child's dream, and usually the top scorers were encouraged. The level of performance in this Yolki was the highest, and the gifts were the most expensive. Adults also celebrated the New Year collectively, although it was originally intended in the USSR as a holiday for children. Nowadays, New Year is considered mostly a family holiday, while back then the Soviet citizens celebrated the New Year in the company of their colleagues, especially if December 31st was a workday. Many enterprises had their own clubs, canteens and cultural centers, where they held celebrations. Several times there were even New Year ball parties organized for the elite in the Kremlin. Officially, January 1st became a day off only since 1947, and only since then did the citizens of the USSR have the opportunity to celebrate New Year properly. Naturally, as technology developed and the general standard of living improved, new traditions emerged. Traditions that have survived to this day. For example, the New Year's Eve Little Blue Light, broadcast on the first national channel. In 1964 it became an annual New Year's program, and for 20 years it was the songs and jokes from this TV program that accompanied every Soviet New Year's holiday. The second tradition was the film Irony of Fate or Enjoy Your Bath from 1976. Ildar Rizanov's comedy was not only firmly associated with the New Year's Eve, it was shown every year, but also itself became a source of some traditions of home decoration for the New Year. The third tradition was a kind of a standard food set for the New Year's table, the inevitable Olivier salad, which had nothing to do with the original Olivier salad recipe. There always was herring under a fur coat, sparkling wine, холодец, Latvian spreads, Skas sausage, homemade cakes and pies, and of course, tangerines. Tangerines were perceived as part of the New Year's miracle, and their smell was strongly associated in the Soviet Union with the smell of the New Year. The USSR received the bulk of these fruits from Morocco, where the main harvest ripens in November and December. It was impossible to find these exotic fruits on store shelves at any other time of the year. After the feast, groups usually went outside to fire Bengal lights and have fun, or to visit their neighbors. However, it was not supposed to be a long New Year's celebration. The children were on winter school vacation, but the adults were already expected at work on January 2nd. What has changed in modern Russia since then? Most traditions, of course, have remained. New Year's Yolki are still held in every school and kindergarten, a festive New Year tree with a red star still stands in every house, gifts are still given, and champagne is still opened at the chimes at midnight. And even the Olivier salad and tangerines are still on the table. But if the salad used to be there because it was a very convenient way to feed the family with non-deficit products, now it is more of a tribute to tradition, like Soviet champagne and red caviar served on buttered bread. Nevertheless, some things have changed in the celebration of the New Year. First, our state has understood the love of its citizens for this holiday and rewarded them not with 1 or 2 days off, but with 10. In 2004, under the new labor code, Russians received 5 New Year's holidays. And in 2012, it was decided to extend the holidays even further, and Russians received the maximum legal New Year's holidays, 8 whole days, from January 1st to 8th. Including Saturdays and Sundays, people usually have as many as 10 days off. In fact, it somewhat reconnects the New Year with church holidays, namely Christmas, which falls on January 7th. Another tradition is the president's New Year's speech. A short presidential address comes on TV at 11:55 p.m. local time in each of Russia's time zones, and the president reflects on achievements from the last year. At midnight, the Kremlin's Spasskaya clock tower chimes and the Russian national anthem begins. By the way, to some extent this tradition originated in the USSR. The country's leader first made a New Year's address to the nation by radio on December 31st, 1941, during the hardest days of the Great Patriotic War. And it was not Stalin, but Mikhail Kalinin, chairman of the Central Executive Committee of the USSR. The New Year's greetings were repeated by him on the eve of 1944. There were 2 more radio messages, in 1953 and in 1957, then made by Kliment Voroshilov, chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. Leonid Brezhnev, General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, began the tradition of television addresses a few minutes before midnight, before the onset of 1971. Then, due to Brezhnev's serious illness, and then serious illness of Yuri Andropov, and then serious illness of Konstantin Chernenko, the practice of personal speeches by the first person of the state was abandoned for several years. The most memorable message happened in 1987, when President Ronald Reagan addressed the Soviet people, and Mikhail Gorbachev addressed the US people. In 1991, when not everyone understood what kind of country we were in and who our leader was, the satirist Mikhail Zadornov wished Russia a Happy New Year. He didn't manage to stay on schedule, so they had to show the pre-recorded New Year chimes because they missed the midnight. Boris Yeltsin decided to distinguish himself by organizing 2 New Year's addresses on the last day of 1999. At noon, he announced his resignation, and at midnight, Vladimir Putin congratulated Russians. And for more than 20 years, this tradition has never disappeared. Millions of Russians gather with their families in front of their TV sets, wait for the president's address and the chime of the Kremlin's clock, and only then open their champagne and eat caviar sandwiches. There are still outdoor festivities with fireworks, but only after midnight. For the majority of Russians, the New Year is first of all a family holiday. So whatever you do in the other 364 days of the year, on December 31st at 11:55 p.m. you just have to gather with your family at the New Year table and celebrate the New Year properly. After all, as you know, how do you celebrate the New Year? So you will spend it. Thanks for watching. It was the last video of the year, so happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. And a huge shout out to my biggest supporters: Steak221, Steven, Yelizaveta Zakharova, Kirill Klimuk, Zeman Böze and Giovanni Zayas. See you guys next year.